Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back. It's lovely to hear the level of conversation that's happening, which is a little bit different from this morning, and so you can see new relationships are being formed. And typically, right after lunch, energy sometimes, goes down, but it's lovely to hear the buzz. I was at one of the breakout sessions this morning with Dr. Michael Ungar, and he spoke about resiliency and how children feel safer and nurturing when there's food around. And I was thinking about that when I was in the Vista Center with all the food that was around. And I certainly feel safe and nurtured. I don't know about the rest of you. I know by the third day, I've been lucky enough to be at the Banff Center a few times, and by the third day, the richness and the bountiness of the food gets to be a little overwhelming, but the first day I take it all in, and that homemade ice cream is certainly something to behold. So just a couple housekeeping comments. First of all, there was a question this morning about PowerPoints and slide decks. So please know that the presenters will be asked for their copies of their slide decks, and they will be posted on our site following the symposium, and links to access them will be sent out to all of you, so you'll be able to access them after the symposium as well too. Another brief comment is regarding the youth forum. As you know, the youth are joining us for the keynotes, and then they are going off and having their own conversations to make sense of what they've heard. And I'm delighted that they're spreading themselves around the room to meet as many of the adults in the room as possible. So don't be surprised if they start to engage you in conversation, or I encourage you to also engage them in conversation, because they're going to be doing a plenary session at the end, and they'll be asked to share their thoughts about what they've learned about mentoring and how it might look over the next 100 years. So please take this time to engage them in that conversation. I think you'll be surprised at how much you'll walk away changed from the conversation, as much as they will too. So now it's my distinct pleasure to introduce our second keynote speaker of the day, Dr. Michael Ungar. And I was thinking about this before I began, because I thought my last keynote, or my last introduction, Michael, this is saying to you, and I'm not making eye contact, I ended up getting a hug afterwards. So this is kind of the testimony to see whether or not, I rate a hug after that. So no pressure on you or me here. So Michael Ungar is both a family therapist and a Killam Professor of Social Work at Dalhousie University, where he co-directs the Resilience Research Centre. And as I mentioned, I got to listen to him this morning speak about a resiliency, which really is a sense of belonging. And I think about all the people in this room and the sense of belonging even that I feel standing here in front of all of you, because this really is a place of belonging in a beautiful, beautiful landscape as well too. So his research is focused on resilience, though, among children, youth, and families, and how together they survive adversity in culturally diverse ways. This is kind of mind-boggling. He's published over 100 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters on this topic, and is the author of 11 books, including The Social Worker, his first novel. In addition to his research and writing, Michael maintains a small family therapy practice in association with Phoenix Youth Programs, a prevention program for street youth and their families, and was the recipient of the 2012 Canadian Association of Social Workers National Distinguished Service Award. His work has been featured in numerous magazines and newspapers around the world, and he regularly appears on radio and television, and I'm sure he embarrasses his children like I embarrass mine. His blog, Nurturing Resilience, can be read on Psychology Today's website. I'm going to make this plug now and then again afterwards. Michael is only here for today. He is leaving tonight. He's got some of his books outside available afterwards. There's not a lot of them. He's got them there at cost. So again, just shows, I guess, his support of this work that's happening today too, and so I encourage you to stop by afterwards and take a look at them. I know I bought a few myself already as Christmas gifts too. So anyway, please join me in welcoming Dr. Michael Ungar. I just want to collect his autograph too.
Okay. I was actually thinking after the stress workshop this morning, I should really give her a little shoulder massage. Wouldn't that be that would be almost more appropriate in keeping here. Thank you very much. I think my my lapel mic's on, so I can actually move around, which is so much nicer. It's a real honor to do this. The work of mentorship, this so incredibly important and crucial that it's kind of like, wow, this is interesting. I do mostly study this notion of resilience, but what's really interesting, of course, is that when you're studying resilience, you're constantly bumping up against this notion of where young people who are quite vulnerable or made vulnerable encounter people who inspire them. So what I'm going to try and do in this next hour is really just, if I can, give you some justification, perhaps, for why this notion of mentors is so critical, especially to more vulnerable children and youth. And if I can sort of perhaps provide some, argue that in a bunch of different ways, and perhaps, I mean, in a sense, it's going to be preaching to the converted, right? I mean, you're all sort of bought into this, but perhaps I can give you a little bit of a theoretical basis to help justify what you're doing, as well, perhaps, to make arguments to funders why, speaking of the government of Alberta is in the room, speaking of, to help justify why these programs should be funded and why they have the great potential to succeed. But, it's funny, most of, despite, you get your bio read and everything else, but most of what I seem to know is mostly from the young people with whom I've been working over the years. And I remember vividly, I was thinking about, how do you sort of encapsulate the idea of mentorship? And I could tell lots of different stories, but one sort of came in an odd flash to me. I was just thinking about a young man who I worked with in, actually was in a correctional facility, so a jail for young people. And he was an older teen. And I remember it was very hard to engage him. I mean, I just somehow didn't have a lot of street cred. I couldn't imagine. I mean, look how, you can imagine I'd have a lot of street cred with like really hardcore delinquents. I know that's hard to imagine not, but it could happen. Anyway, so what was interesting though was this, we had a janitor, a superintendent for the facility. This was quite a reasonably good sized facility, and this guy's name was Robert. And what Robert did was he was the one who painted and mowed the lawns and did all that kind of fix-up stuff. And it was interesting that in this facility, and these are pretty hardcore kids, these are kids on serious criminal, violent offenses, that type of thing. A lot of them are locked away for 1 or 2 years, this type of thing. And I remember vividly that one of the highest privileges in this facility was if you calmed down enough and if you sort of, played along enough, the highest privilege was that you got to work with Robert. And Robert was a sort of a salt-of-the-earth kind of guy, right? He was a big fella, he's a strong fella, he could fix anything. On the weekends he would go out hunting and fishing, and he'd bring back stories about what, the moose he bagged or whatever it was that he just sort of talked about. As you can imagine, not conversations that I was having with the kids myself, And it was kind of like in that energy of Robert being in the facility. And I still remember that one of the things the kids most loved to do if they really got their act together was to go down to Robert's little work shed, which was in this kind of closed custody facility. Any of you work in or know of being in a closed custody facility for youth? It's like these little cottages, quote unquote, that are arranged behind a fence. And the idea is you have usually like an acre or two of green space or grass in the middle. And of course the grass has to be cut. And so the kid who was allowed to do this would then go down and join Robert in the little shed, and Robert would deck the kid out to go and mow the lawn. Now, Robert had a little ride-on lawnmower. And if you were really good, you got to go into the shed, and what Robert would do is he'd put on these big steel-toed boots. Right? And then he'd put on pants that you can use when you're chainsawing. So you can actually, which I do, but you can actually put a chainsaw practically on your leg and you wouldn't cut your leg off. Very, very sturdy clothing. And then he kind of put on those kinds of long lumberjack coats, right? And then he had this helmet thing with this great big visor, I guess, so the grass, when you cut it, wouldn't sort of seep up into your face and take out an eye or something like that, I guess. And then there was all this other, and then there was gloves and everything. And the best part of it all, I used to really remark, was that the kids would also then have to put on a vest that had a great big fluorescent orange X on it. Now, that always confused me slightly because in this kind of closed custody secured facility, there were no other vehicles driving around. But, here was the kid in this fluorescent. And I still remember the kids kind of coming out of Robert's little shed with him sort of admiring them. Of course, there was always that element of, okay, you're ready, now you're ready to get on that lawnmower and take on the world sort of thing. And there was this just great synergy, and the kids would always walk out. They'd just be buoyed up from this experience of being trusted with this kind of great responsibility. And they would come out, you could almost hear the Rocky music behind them. You know, they sort of come out as gladiators, you know, da-da-da. And then they throw their leg over that little putt of a lawnmower, and then they sort of get to sort of cruise around. And of course, all the other kids would notice them and everything else. And as silly as all that sounds, what I learned from that, and what I learned from Robert, was that he could actually get through to those kids in ways that I couldn't. There was a synergy. There was something that he talked in the same language that many of them talked. Not that I didn't have my own successes with these kids. I got through to them in a very different way, using my own sense of self and my own professional means and that type of thing. But Robert had that certain magic. He could inspire them. They knew that he believed in them, and that he genuinely could give them opportunities to experience themselves as competent, and for a particular moment, I'm going to argue, even a little bit in control of their lives. Now, what I'm wondering about out loud is, are kids just naturally able to do well, or in fact, are we really seeing a phenomenon here where we can actually make kids do well? That I think sometimes when I study resilience, for instance, and I was just talking about this before lunch, was that I think what resilience is about is the things that we give kids so that they can do well. And I think Robert gave those boys and girls, by the way, in that facility, an opportunity to experience themselves in a certain kind of way. And that's extremely special. Now, here's the really interesting thing about some of this. This is not my own research. This is borrowed from a study out of BC from a few years ago. And this is a pattern that I keep seeing in the research, both in my own and in others. And what it shows is, essentially, if you took a bunch of kids who are physically abused and have experienced sexual abuse as well, and you ask them, and what you're actually trying to understand is how suicidal they are. Do they often think about suicide? And we know, and again, I'm kind of concentrating here on vulnerable youth, we know that vulnerable youth who have experienced physical and sexual abuse are much more likely to think about suicide and potentially to try suicide. Would that be a reasonable truth that many of you would know firsthand from your working in this field? Okay. What's interesting as one of the things that seems to make a difference, though, in these kids' lives is they ask the kids, how connected do you feel at school? Not so much your academic performance, which is a different thing altogether. They ask the kids about their engagement with school. Do they think that school is a place that's meaningful in their lives? Do they feel like they belong? Do they feel like they're connected at their school? And the kids who said yes, or the kids that scored higher on a measure of engagement in their educational environment, actually recorded far less suicidality in their lives. Which begs the question, the next time we're working with very traumatized children who have experienced physical and sexual violence, do we offer them an interview for an hour with a psychologist, a clinical social worker, or a child and youth care worker, or some other professional? Or do we intervene to get them some sort of meaningful connection with someone who knows them at their school? And my argument is, and this is what I think the research shows very clearly, that while all children benefit from engagement at school, there is an immensely huge impact from children experiencing that engagement with people who really can care about them when you've come through great adversity and a little bit more sort of a tragic experience. In other words, having, that moment at school, how many of you have schools that perhaps where you have a vice principal or a teacher who greets every child by name as they come in the school, right? Do you have schools like that here in some of your communities where that kind of makes that impact? And I realize that's not necessarily a mentorship relationship, but when that grows from that to more of a relationship, it seems that it has the potential to have a profound effect on children's mental well-being. Now, what I'm sort of getting at here is that I think what we can do is we can actually make kids more resilient. In other words, we can actually by shaping their environment, or the way I like to say it is, nurture trumps nature when it comes to these kids. Which is why, of course, that putting caring adults creating a network of relationships for kids, it has a particularly profound effect on them, even to the point of influencing that intangible quality of grit or perseverance. There's again some interesting researching. Some people are definitely showing that when we provide a child with a sense of hopefulness for the future, that they are influenced by that. There's a definite change in that relationship. I mean, how many have you been following at all the pathways to education phenomenon in Canada? Some of you know what I'm talking about. Anybody? Right? Pathways is this really remarkable program, and it started off in Regent Park just in the Toronto region. And what it was an effort to get kids to finish high school. I don't know if you know, by the way, that the families, it was actually the idea of the families in this subsidized housing project development in Toronto. The community developers, as far as I understand the story, the community developers went to the people there and said, how can we help? And the people in these awful housing projects that are now being sort of torn down and changed over, said, could you just get our kids to go to finish high school? That would be absolutely something wonderful. And what they were able to do, the way they were able to do that and validate it as a model of intervention was, first of all, they provided the families themselves. They took all the grade 9s. They offered to every single grade 9 student this package of interventions. Now, there was a lot of problems in these families. There was a lot of problems in their communities, in the neighborhoods. But as far as I understand, what they were able to do was they were able to offer the families, so basically all these grade 9s were sort of given this opportunity to help them to get to finish grade 12. They were given an advocate, somebody who could represent the family's needs to the school and in the community. They were also given, as far as I understand, after-school tutoring for free to all the kids that wanted it, so that they had access to the skills, the supports that they would need to excel in their education. They also, as far as I understand, provided group mentors. I met some of these mentors. Just sort of good folks from the communities, from across the Toronto community who wanted to help kids to thrive. Making that relationship. I think giving them that sense that if you persevered through school, good things could possibly open up for you. But what was even more interesting was the fourth element that Pathways to Education. And those of you who know the program, you know the one I've left out, right? Money. They gave the kids $1,000 a year bursary that was put away in a sort of a secured fund for them for every year of high school that they finished. So if they finished grade 9, grade 10, 11, and 12, they would have, as far as I understand, $4,000 in a fund for their future education. And that actually created a humongous change. In combination with all these other factors, they were actually able to change the dropout rate from something like in the low 40, the number of kids who were completing high school before they started the project was somewhere, I can't remember, 25% or 40% or something like that. And they got it up into the high 80 percentiles. Remarkable story of change. And if you think about it, it's one in which mentors definitely played a role. But, my point here is, a mentor alone is not enough. I got to say that if I have one criticism of the mentorship field, it's that it's sometimes naively trotted out, often by politicians, as the somehow remarkable solution. Oh, well, if we just take this kid who's this delinquent, right? And even in my little story about, Robert and this wonderful kid who rides the lawnmower, oh, wow, it's just like this magic pill and it's just going to change everything. And in fact, that's not what the research shows at all. Unfortunately, that's one of these lovely little myths. Oh, yes, it's always the relationship. I often get asked in my studies of resilience, well, they'll hear me speak for an hour and a half or 2 days or something, and people will still come up at the end and say, Mike, it's really then about just like having an adult care about you. I go, no. Didn't you hear? I talked about, even in Pathways, they were talking about advocacy, right? Helping parents connect to schools. Then they also gave the kid money. Money helps, too, create hope for the future. Didn't you hear all that stuff, right? The mentor is part of a complex weave, a whole network of relationships that seem to potentiate or leave the potential that things are actually going to get much better in life for kids. Now, we've been actually doing this research all around the world. I have partnerships in actually more than 40 different countries looking at what it is that makes kids survive and thrive. I'm just back from Japan and China. I've been in the Netherlands recently. I'm in India in a couple of weeks from now. It's when you actually go global on this, you begin to see these patterns. And I guess what's hopeful perhaps for this room is that you constantly see this notion of relationships as one of these key factors which are very, very predictive of kids being more able to cope in life. But if you look on this map, the other factors are also there, and they're sort of equally balanced off. They're sort of like one of those. You ever given one of those children's toys? You know, with the sort of the squeegee little blue strings between it, and you squish it one way, and it sort of pops out the other way. That type of thing. This model is very much the same. There's a lot of interdependency here. So if you think about having a relationship with a mentor, with an adult who cares about you, with a principal who greets you at the front door of your school, those kinds of moments. Well, you're going to develop a little bit more powerful identity. You're going to know who you are by being reflected back that you're somebody who's valued. You're going to have, in your life, more likely you're going to have aspects of efficacy or power and control. You're going to have a better sense that you can change your world, especially if you have a helper who's there alongside of you. You're going to be treated more fairly in your world, which is sort of the essence of social justice, because you're going to have someone to help advocate for you. You're also going to have, I'm going to argue, some sort of sense of belonging or social cohesion. And you're going to be connected somewhere, whether that's at your school, if that's where the mentor is sort of based, or at some other part of your life. And of course, if the mentor has some sort of cultural continuity to you, they're connected to your culture and your heritage, then of course that mentorship also has the potential to increase another aspect of building capacity, resilience, strengths, whatever words you want to use, and that's that sort of sense of continuity over time, that someone has reconnected you with your particular culture and history. Now, again, I guess what's challenging about this, of course, is that you have to think about this in sort of what's contextually relevant to the actual children themselves. Just checking here. So, for instance, there's an interesting study of something called positive deviance. It's a lovely idea. And what they do is they study they study examples of people who are adapting in environments which nobody else is adapting. So you go into a context where basically this started off looking at food scarcity. It was one of the first positive deviance studies. So they'd go into a place where everyone appeared to be basically hungry and where food insecurity was rampant, and they'd look at the families that were actually feeding their children, and they'd say, how exactly are you doing that? And then they would become, in a sense, the experts. In fact, if I honestly had to give you $1 million to invest in programming, my very first step is always to go to the people who are actually surviving the adversity you're trying to address and ask them how they're doing it. And when you learn from them, you usually get it right in terms of your programming. So away we go. One of the more interesting studies was of Latina girls in the United States who had made it to university despite all the risk factors that would predict an early pregnancy, dropping out, and going in a route of early motherhood as opposed to finishing their university degrees. So this was the population. They had the population risk factors were things like they had a mother who had had a child early. Often they were in sole parent families. Let's see, what other risk factors? The girls often had a boyfriend who was at least 3 years older than them. I have a daughter, by the way, and that's always been a bit of a worry. That's a common predictor. And if you have daughters who are teenagers, by the way, just to let you know that is actually a risk factor, by the way. If your daughter is dating a boy 3 years older, it is actually quite a risk factor for certain things you don't want to have happen. Just thought I'd mention that. Or maybe you do want to. I don't think you want to have happen. These girls were basically interviewed and said, well, how is it that you ended up in university despite all these risk factors? I mean, most of your peers are pregnant early. I mean, to be truthful, right? Very high-risk neighborhoods, very marginalized, socially marginalized. Why aren't you basically, how did you ever do this pathway? They found a few interesting things. One of them, by the way, it had nothing to do with sex education. Everyone always thinks, well, it's because somebody gave them the information they need about sex. And that's actually not it. There were two, though, social factors which predicted the change in a very, very powerful way. The first was a mother who said to their daughters, every time their daughters would go out on a date or something, or, you know, it would be midweek, they'd be going out on a date, it's 9 o'clock at night or whatever, they're 16 years old and that type of thing. And the girls were asked, well, what did your mother say when you were leaving the house? Because, of course, you'd think the mother was slipping them some condoms or suggesting maybe they don't be sexually active or something like that. In fact, nope. What the mothers would do was yell at their daughters before they left the house, hey, you, make sure you remember tonight, you are going to finish your education. That was the message. You are going to finish your education, not don't have sex. You are going to finish your education. I think that in some respects the mothers knew that they could not control the sexual behaviors of their daughters, but they could give them the expectation and the hopefulness for the future that they were going to complete schooling. The other really interesting piece in the data was that these girls all had an older male figure in their lives who was not their father, who had paid attention to them and really doted on them and believed in them. Isn't that interesting? That sort of relationship was always there. Now, and we're not talking a sexual relationship. We're not talking their boyfriends. We're not talking sort of an older male that was abusing them or anything like that. What we're talking about is a positive, adapted relationship with an older uncle, community member, teacher, somebody who looked at the girl and said, basically, I believe in you, who gave them a sense of identity, hopefulness for the future, and all these other things that we know are much more likely to predict well-being for kids. So, all right. That's the terrain, right? Now, how do I always like to say that, you know, it's great in theory. So there's a bunch of theory and a few little studies that I've talked about. But, you know, does it really hold up? And I'm sort of thinking about this. So let me see if I can sort of bring this fully around. Let me start with myself a little bit. Okay, grade 7, right? Grade 7. I'm in a school. I moved to Northern Ontario from Montreal. And I'm a little brainy. A little nerdy, and this is before Sheldon, so nerds weren't that cool quite yet. I was a generation behind. And I'm in this classroom, and I'm sort of the new kid in the school. And of course, the bullies at that time, it's like I have a big walking sticker on me that says, you know, you can bully me, because I'm not really attached to other kids, right? So I'm a bit of a lone wolf, a loner in that classroom until I connect to the other kids. And in this class, by the way, there is another boy named Jeffrey. And Jeffrey just basically knew that I was quite vulnerable and stuff, and that he decided to pick on me for at least a few months of my grade 7 year. Now, I don't know, by the way, I always wonder, as I've been showing this photo out around Canada for the last few years, I'm just wondering if Jeffrey happens to be in the audience. I'm okay, we can chat later and stuff. And I actually forgive Jeffrey, because in some ways, Jeffrey taught me a lot about why kids sometimes choose very deviant patterns of coping in their lives, and potentially the power of people to intervene. You see, Jeffrey, I don't think he had anybody intervening in his life. Jeffrey was a bully because really what did he have to emulate? His older brother had already been in jail. His father had struggled with alcoholism and drug addictions. As far as I understood, Jeffrey was an abused child, and this was all sort of circulating around the community. So what choice did Jeffrey really have? He had latched on. He wasn't academically inclined. So it's almost like he had, in this kind of wasteland of opportunities, he had simply latched on to one identity, one thing that he could do well, which was beat the living crap out of every other kid that came near him, right? And that was his sort of thing that got him out of bed in the morning. At least he had one place that he could feel powerful. He could stand on my shoulders and make himself feel taller. It wasn't very comfortable being down there on the ground with him, but below him, but at least I'm sort of understanding. Now, more recently, so Jeffrey, if you're out there, I think I've forgiven you. Thank you very much. But more recently, we did some research with, I occasionally evaluate programs for different programs that intervene with high-risk youth. And what was interesting recently, we evaluated one of the initiatives to prevent gang violence in Canada. There was a bunch of, about 14 demonstration sites back a few years ago, and we were the lead evaluators on one of them in the Halifax region. This was a program aimed at kids aged 9 to 14 who, quote unquote, which was really disgusting if you think about going and trying to sell a program to a community and say, yeah, we'd like to prevent your 9 to 14-year-olds from becoming future gang members. Like it's a bit of fatalistic, isn't it? Like, hi, would you let me help your child? We really believe he's going to grow up to become a gang member. It's not like something that parents really engage well with, right? That, neither here nor there. What we were working with was, so the program itself is targeting 9 to 14-year-olds to had all the same criminogenic factors as a kid like Jeffrey. A parent who formerly had been in jail, or an older brother or older sibling who'd been in jail, a pattern of delinquency early in their lives, violence, learning disabilities, all the sort of the factors that might put them onto a negative trajectory. Now, what was interesting was the program was very successful. It actually so successful that the Halifax Regional Municipality recently picked it up, and even after the federal funding ended, they actually agreed to continue the project at about $600,000 a year. So it was a very successful program, and the evaluation showed that that the program could work. What I found particularly intriguing was why it worked. And it wasn't because of professional interventions. What they had done, and this was not necessarily by design, this was a little bit of serendipity and chance and everything else. The families that they were working with did not want people like me in their houses, right? They were burnt out on child welfare workers and psychologists and social work, everybody it felt like everybody had sort of been trying to help these families, and it really hadn't gone that well. So what this group of workers did was they hired people mostly from the communities that they were trying to help. So people who kind of were a little bit less distant from the scenes that they were trying to get into. They were trying to get into the homes of these very, very high-risk kids. And they also didn't have as many credentials. Some of them had a bachelor's degree, but most of them tended to have college degrees, and they tended to have just sort of more street experience. So they'd been working in, boys and girls clubs and YMCAs, and they'd be sort of youth workers and out in the communities and good volunteers. And they were generally younger. Most of them were sort of well under 30, and definitely some of them under 25. And what was interesting, partly was because of funding, right? They didn't have a lot of money to hire people with lots and lots of letters after their name. So they kind of had to go with the second rung team, And it was, at first it kind of felt like that, and then they realized that they had just struck gold. That these workers that they had hired actually had the in to these families. These families didn't feel so incredibly put out by them. So when these guys showed up after school and had to, bring the kid home from the school because the kid had been, beating up somebody at school or whatever the case was, the families could listen to, Paul, who was had lived in their community at one point. Paul was credible when he said, look, I think you got to, don't beat your kid, don't beat him, because that's not going to help. Let's try something else. I have some suggestions on how to deal with this, right? And all of a sudden that was working. Plus the kid themselves, they felt comfortable with Paul. There was a connection. It wasn't threatening. There was a sense that, hey, Paul could actually could engage with this kid, and the kid began to turn to Paul. So the program had a lot of success, but largely it was a people factor that actually made the particular difference in this particular group. From an interesting point of view, from a measurement design, I know some of you are researchers. Some of you are researchers in the room too, eh? Just a small note on this. It was really interesting. Not all of our results showed increases in functioning like that. Actually, some of our results showed either just a flat line, that the kids did not get worse, and in some cases even a little bit of a dip. But think about it. The control groups of kids who didn't get the service went like this over the 3 years that we were measuring them. They were basically swimming in their own stew of problems. They were the Jeffreys of the world. They were getting more and more excited about guns. They were getting more and more excited about violence. They were getting more and more, they had no opportunities to figure out things on their own, so they were just basically making it up on their own. And sure enough, they were turning more and more violent, more and more like the gang members that we were trying to prevent. What was interesting was the kids who were getting the intervention I mean, they were still kids. They were still living in high-risk neighborhoods. They were still hearing about guns. They were still hearing about violence. They were still enamored with all that. But the suppression effect was such that the intervention, this mentorship, this connection to an older person who saw in them some potential to be something a little bit different, was actually changing their life in a really, really effective and good way. So I guess what we're sort of beginning to quickly understand is some of these core ideas about what makes kids survive really well. You can call it resilience. You can use a different word. It doesn't really matter to me. The point being is that we know that kids who are coming through adversity, there is definitely some power in relationships, as all the stories I've telling you sort of illustrate, from the Latina girls to the kids in jail, riding the lawnmower. There's always an element of relationship. But as I've wanted to emphasize, the complexity also must be appreciated. If you just throw a relationship in there, but you leave a toxic neighborhood, a toxic family, a toxic school, and everything else, that mentor, unless it's a magical, magical relationship, is not going to have that much change, that much of an influence on the kids' lives. Let me give you a little bit of background on why that is, a little bit of the theory here behind all this. First of all, I've already said that there's a few key principles that I work from. One, of course, I've always said is basically nurture trumps nature. It's not about the individual child. The individual child, like Jeffrey, could want to change, but if they're not given opportunities and supported in those changes, they're not going to change. The second core principle, which I've been hinting at here, is this notion of differential impact. And very, very clearly, a mentor will mean more to a child who's disadvantaged than to a child that is well-resourced. There's an interesting bit of studies here. I'll give you a parallel example, okay? So how many of you have children in school? Some of you have children in the school system, right? Do the teachers communicate with you and they send home, they have like a website, or they let you know what's up with your kids? Do they just want to do a little bit of that? Some of that engagement with your school? There's not much evidence that it actually improves outcomes for children. For all the effort that we parents insist that schools engage with us and the kids' learning, there's not a huge amount of research that shows a dramatic effect on our children's outcomes just because we know what they're doing. But there is a dramatic bit of research that shows that for kids who have conduct disorder, the communication between the school and the family will have a dramatic impact on outcomes. You see, the child who has conduct disorder, who experiences at home and at school the same behavioral management strategies, will actually have those reinforced and is much more likely to succeed in their educational environment, especially if the school is attentive also to the parents. So the parents can tell the school, well, I just tried something at home around bedtimes. That's really working with my kid who's 8 years old. I would like you to try it in the classroom. Could you re-emphasize some of the messages I'm giving? And the school says to the parent, well, actually, we're trying a few little things to get the kid to sort of focus and not get up and run around the classroom. Could you help us and support us at school? And when they're actually working together, you can have a dramatic impact. But all those other certificates, all that other communication that most of us parents, the parents, the parent-teacher interviews. I know my kids actually did quite well in school, so I always wondered why the heck I was there in parent-teacher interviews. Like, what do I care? I mean, it's fine, so they're doing well. Like, I knew that. Like, why am I here? It's a little bit of that. I mean, we all sort of dress it up, but it has almost no impact. But that's why I'm sort of understanding this in that particular way. The other factor, of course, is that resilience is cumulative. The factors that predict resilience and coping and outcomes, they accumulate over time, so the more that you have. So when you set up a mentorship relationship, think about it. It creates a domino effect, doesn't it? The kid is no longer roaming the streets. There is actually a sustained relationship. Through that relationship, the kid might be attached to some sort of activity that they don't know. They're taken to play basketball. They're helped to learn an instrument. They're taught some sort of other social skill. There's a domino effect of sort of one thing leading to another, which is very evident. And usually, again, I'm trying to introduce that complexity. Of course, as I've sort of hinted here, context and culture influence a great deal also what matters most in terms of what's going to be successful to kids. Let me give you maybe a little bit of a controversial example. Um, a little while ago, I'll check my time. A little while ago, I was working with a young man. He had gone through the, this kid had child welfare workers. He was he was from a First Nations community in Eastern Canada. He had gone through the systems. He also, his parents were, had their own sets of very, very severe problems. This kid had basically had to raise himself. He had been raised mostly on reserve. He had developed a whole pattern of violence, substance abuse, alcohol abuse. He was known in his community as one mean little effer who would sort of take on anybody. And of course, but as a consequence, the RCMP had quite often had to arrest him through his early years, even down to his age 12, and had sort of his incarcerations and his treatments and secure treatment and all this kind of stuff had gotten progressively more stringent over time. He was a real tough kid, tough kid to engage with. Now, what was interesting about this was that nobody had ever managed to reach this kid. He was 17 when I finally began to work with him. And you can imagine his reaction to me, right? It's like, for 5 years I've been kicking around the system. I don't need another, I don't need another social worker. I don't need anybody to help me. It's like, just leave me alone. I'm figuring this out on my own. I'll get back out and I'll just, be that much better a criminal. Just get out of my face. Anyways, he was in a custodial facility long enough that he at least calmed down. And one of the things that he got because of that was the privilege to be discharged temporarily for 1 week. And the idea in his case planning team was we would help him connect to a job. We figured, okay, how are we ever going to give this kid any hope for the future? He's obviously not going to do well in school ever. What could we possibly offer him? And in our sort of mighty ideals and idealism and stuff, a whole bunch of sort of treatment team, away we go, and we think, oh well, we'll help him to have a career, not a career, but some sort of job, and then maybe he'll divert himself away from his delinquency. Sound good? Simple strategy, right? Makes sense. Anyways, long and the short of it is, we discharge him, and this is back a few years ago, and we decide that he has an uncle who's a fisherman, a lobster fisherman. So that sounds good, right? Put him on a boat, one of his uncles, he'll go out, he'll learn to fish. It's a very viable career opportunity in the eastern part of Canada, as it is in other parts of the west as well. Away we go. Except what we didn't realize was that his uncle actually fished out of a place called Burnt Church. Now, anyone from the East Coast? This is Alberta. Half of you are from the East Coast. What? You know Burnt Church. So you might remember the episode that happened there where the native fishermen were fighting it out for their treaty rights to be honored, to maintain a fishery. And essentially, for the simplicity's sake, let's call them the up in Caracat, I believe, was the other community, where it was predominantly white fishermen who felt like the native fishermen were taking their unfair share of the fish stock. In this case, I believe it was lobster. And I might be getting some of the facts just a little bit jumbled, so my apologies, but basically this is sort of the way they were languaging it at the time, as far as I can recall. And so you had Aboriginal treaty rights standing up against sort of economics and stuff. And eventually this escalated into almost all-out war. Fishing traps were being cut and sunk, and boats were being burnt, if I remember, and there was threats of gun violence and this type of thing back and forth between the two communities. And eventually, if I remember correctly, the Canadian Armed Forces got a little bit involved, the RCMP, of course, and our other marine services to basically squash this and basically have all the boats go back to the shore until this could be resolved peacefully. That was a good theory, except the Aboriginal fishermen, of course, didn't particularly like being told to go back when they felt like they had a legitimate treaty right to go onto the water. Now, into this incredibly complex political and dangerous social situation, we inadvertently released this young man from our custody facility to go with his uncle to fish in Burnt Church. And his uncle was actually running the blockade with his fishing boat and was taking on the Canadian Navy ships who were chasing him around the Gulf of St. Lawrence firing live ammunition over the bow of the boat to get them to put back to shore. This kid came back to us a week later. His eyes were like saucers. He was so turned on to life. He was so content. He had found his mission. He had found a place where his talent for asserting his rights, for being aggressive and out there, had a place. He'd also found a set of mentors. He had found, what did they? I'm going to Aboriginal warriors, the Aboriginal warrior societies, the masks. We've seen this on our televisions. We've seen it in the Oka crisis. We've seen it in the West. There's been a number of similar disputes. We've seen it on the East Coast. We've seen it more recently in Southern Ontario as well. This kid attached to these young men, most of them younger men. He attached to them. He got inspired by them. Suddenly he saw a culturally relevant way of feeling proud as a young Aboriginal man, First Nations boy in this particular country. He all of a sudden has another way to express himself, and he found a set of talents. Now, just think about that as an intervention, because I was toying with this a little bit later and saying, okay, that's really interesting, because no one had ever reached him, and suddenly this kid is fired up about the future. He has a future orientation. He has a hopefulness for the future. He's willingly connected to his culture. He's connected to his community. He's connected to mentors and adults, and he's listening to people, and he wants to go through sweats, and all of a sudden there's this kind of engagement in the world that is not necessarily completely, quote-unquote, dysfunctional. Or is it? Depending on how you view it, isn't it? Right? Whose sides, who's a freedom fighter and who's a terrorist? It's an interesting question, isn't it, right? Who's fighting? Whose rights here are being asserted in which way? I don't want to make a judgment either way. What I do know is that we had a kid who got fired up because he met some older people who inspired him to change his life and change it in a direction that made sense culturally to him, that nobody else had ever presented to this kid a viable alternative to his abusive, violent behaviors that he was showing in his own community. But I do remember going back into the treatment teams and going, wow, that worked well, kinda. So let's see, the next time we have a 17-year-old chronically delinquent boy, why don't we put him on a fishing boat and let people fire rounds of live ammunition at him or something like that? And of course, it wouldn't work, right? It would only work in a particular context, in a particular setting, which is why you really do have to see. I mean, that's why I'm always sort of the other thing about resilience and coping and stuff like that is that long-term, not all strategies that people use are advantageous. I would argue that this boy who was raised in that particular setting was probably using his violent behaviors as a coping strategy, and they seem to be working reasonably well given the resources that he had to work with. Once we change the resources, once we put an appropriate person and relationships in front of him, he changed. And that seems to be this strange dynamic between what people need and how we adapt our environments to meet their needs. In fact, it's a dance, isn't it? A good mentoring relationship, like any good aspect of that's going to help someone, has to be a bit of a. It's not just us offering. Would you also say it's also about what people people having a say over getting what they need? That there's got to be a bit of a back and forth. I mean, the kid who rode the lawnmower, I kept offering, hey, come on, talk to me. And he said, no effing way do I want to talk to you. You're just not relevant to me. The gang prevention project. If I'd gone into those families, my argument was I would have represented something that they did not want. It's not that I wasn't behind the scenes or couldn't have been behind the scenes coaching and supporting and helping and eventually have done some trauma work with some of those kids. That would have been effective. But I think the neat thing about mentors is sometimes they're able to be negotiated. They're able to figure out exactly, so they meet people's needs. Let me make that a little more real. Do you ever do a game of mirrors? You all work with kids, so I figured I'd bring you a little game of mirrors. Do you know mirrors? Little very simple exercise. Can I just get a volunteer? Somebody would you mind coming up for just a second? I won't embarrass you. Me? Yeah, would you mind? Anybody? Yeah. No? Would anybody? Would you come up for a second? Great. Very, very simple exercise. This is mirrors. This whole thing takes about 30 seconds. I'm just going to show you the very first part.
Okay.
Hi, do you work with kids?
Yes.
Oh, you're going to love this. Okay. So you ever do mirrors with them?
No.
Okay, this has 3 parts though, okay? So the first part, just hold your hands up. You don't have to touch if you don't want. I'm going to move my hand. You got to move your hand. You're my mirror. If I smile, you got to smile. And if I was beginning to walk, you'd have to begin to walk.
Okay.
Okay? Can you grab a partner? One person leads. 10 seconds. One person leads for 10 seconds. Would you just try that? Great.
Okay,
Thanks.
thank you.
Okay, wait, stop. Wait, part 2. It's revenge. Revenge time. Other person gets the lead. Okay, wait, part 3. Don't move. Part 3. Could everyone just go back to your very first position with your hands palms to palms sort of thing? Now, I know you're great communicators, but no predetermination of who leads. No winks, no nods, no verbal cues, nothing. You can't decide who's going to lead. You just got to start and see what happens. All right, thank you. Thank you. Wow. Okay. Well, now, okay, so I'm always very curious whenever I do that with a group. I'm curious, did people moved? Most of you moved, right? And how did you decide to move? Did somebody start, generally? And did that person remain the bully? The leader all the way? They continued. You passed, there was a bit of a motion back and forth? Right? For some of you, at least? The ones who are the bullies, the leaders are not going to admit it anyways, right? Look, it's a bit like that in this work. I'm going to argue that in this relationships, this complexity that I'm trying to introduce to you, it's one thing to throw a mentor in front of people. It's another to be negotiating with people you're trying to meet the needs of so that relationship is sort of negotiated, right? So the mentor comes in, hi, I'd like to try and engage with you. I'd like to help you get through school. And if that's a meaningfully reinforced value, then the kid's going to follow, right? We're going to sort of join with that. But if it's a completely irrelevant person, set of opportunities, then they're going to reject it. The kids, or what they're going to try and do, well, you want me to do what kind of activity? That's not really my thing, but what about this? And at what point does it become, some of you have been mentors, right? And or some of you have been mentored. I certainly was mentored at one point in my life. I have a great memory of a mentor in my life. And I'm just thinking of that relationship where he sort of, at one point I was going in this direction. He said, well, look, Mike, that's probably going to screw you up for life. What if you went this direction? What about a little bit of this? And I went, I don't know if I can go there that fast. So how about, and we would find a little bit of a middle ground. Is that intuitively at kind of gut level make sense to most folks? That there is that little bit of a dance. And I'm going to argue that in that dance, we find ways of being more contextually relevant, more culturally relevant. We find ways of identifying for people the key factors that are actually going to accumulate, that we become that more important part of their life, that differential impact that I've been talking about, which is so important. Now, in a sense, that's the theoretical lens. That's why mentors probably work so well. They inspire us to make changes, and when they're negotiated like that, I think it really matters because a child who's adapted in one particular way, if a mentor comes on and says, maybe you can adapt in a slightly different way, it feels like they will follow. It feels like they will follow. But here's some of the sad truths. I want to sort of give you some sense of this. Now, this is a structural equation model, which is really unfair to show people after they've had lunch, a structural equation model, because it kind of makes you woozy a little bit. And you probably can't even see that because it's not big enough, but I'm just going to walk you through some really interesting ideas. This is from some research we're doing. We currently have a sample of 7,000 kids in 5 different countries. In Canada, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal communities. We have people in New Zealand, China, Colombia, South Africa. And what's really interesting is we're looking at kids who are service users. We have kids who are using child welfare, mental health, corrections, special education services. These are kids with really complex needs. And here's the sad truth. What they're saying to us, and this is what the numbers really show, is that the kids who are getting the most services are not the kids from the most disadvantaged neighborhoods. If ever there was an argument for why informal helpers are needed in our systems, it's because our formal healthcare systems, our formal health systems, are not getting to the kids who are most vulnerable in Canada or in other countries. What this shows is there's actually a negative relationship, a significant and negative relationship between the contextual risks a child faces and the amount of services that they use and also their experiences of services. Meaning, not only do kids who come out of tougher environments don't get the services they need, to the same extent that kids who come out of less tough environments, they get more services. They also don't get services they like very much, which is even weirder. So here we are investing billions and billions of dollars, and those kids who are getting the services tend to be the ones from the lower risk populations. But think about that, right? If you have to show up at school to meet with a guidance counselor because the school's provided an interview or some help to the kid and they want to meet the parents, when do they schedule that stupid interview? When do they schedule that? During school hours. Most of the most vulnerable parents, do they have jobs that they can leave? Do they have the benefit packages that uppity university professors like me have? I can knock, except for my actual teaching hours, which is only about 3 hours a week, I can knock off any time I want. And the entire system seems to be set up for people like me, not the recent immigrants who are working 2 jobs to try and support a family on minimum wage, not the sole parents who are trying to raise a family of 3 and do everything without a partner. Those families cannot make those appointments, and yet somehow we design services in ways that do not meet their needs, which kind of begs the question, or begs the idea then, of course, more informal services like mentorship programs, informal outreach programs, Big Brothers, Big Sisters, et cetera, make a lot of sense for more vulnerable populations and will have, if I can say it again, this differential impact. Our data also says, unfortunately, something else which is even worse, is that the kids who are from those contextually more risky environments don't like their services very much. You know that negotiation I just described? They don't tend to be negotiated with as much, right? They tend to be offered services that are not always relevant to them, which admires me when I work with a program like the Youth Advocate Program in Halifax, the gang prevention program I just talked about. There was a real sense of the youth advocates could be flexible. They were there in the evenings. They were there in the mornings if they had to be. They could be there at lunch hour on the schools. You know the only people who did not like the youth advocates was the professionals. The youth advocates kept asking the professionals to meet for case conferences. You know those sort of, you try and get 4 or 5 people because this kid, you're the kid and you have your social worker, your mental health worker, you have a social assistance worker, you have a housing worker, your mother has an abuse counselor or whatever, et cetera, and you have a guidance counselor. These advocates would come in and say, could we get you all together so we could talk about a coordinated case plan for this? You folks never respected me. You folks were so uptight about your professional credentials that you would not come to a meeting called by somebody without credentials. So we had to adapt. The program adapted, and what they would do is have you've heard of serial monogamy? So they'd have serial meetings. Okay, I'd go and talk to you, and then I'd 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 talk to you. And then I'd come back and get a plan together, and then I go back and talk to you and tell you what it is, tell you what it is, tell you what it is, tell you what it is. because you guys did not respect. If I have a PhD, if I called all of you together, generally speaking, you show up. I don't know why, but you'd show up. If the guy who's actually doing the grunt work, the actual frontline work, and is actually engaged with the family and knows on the ground what's happening, calls it, they don't show up, which sucks. Totally sucks. But that's the truth of what was happening. So what was happening here was that these services were not necessarily being tailored to the kids well. And the more, what we began to understand was that when you adapted these services, you actually got kids connected. Anyway, if you actually wanted to change the outcomes for this, what we were actually discovering was the better you are at providing services that kids actually like and feel that they need. Let me show you the questions actually. What's a service that a kid likes? And if you think about it, why do kids like mentors? Here's the questions we ask kids to decide if they like services. If a kid answers on us, that was the measure, by the way. That's actually what it looks like. We have a whole bunch of, I'm not going to go into all the research protocols of how we do this and everything else, but essentially we have this whole measure. End of the day is these are the questions. We ask a kid, say, hey, overall, are you satisfied with the services that you've received? Overall, do you like the services? We ask the kid, do you help choose your services? Do you get some say over your services? We ask the kid, the people helping me, did they stick by you? Were they there for you over time? 4, I felt like I had someone within the service to talk to when I was in trouble. Not 3 weeks later, but immediately, when I had the crisis. Question number 5, these are all sort of the kids will sort of they self-report, right? So the next question, number 5, is the kid will be asked, the kid would have to respond to the statement, I had a say in how the service was delivered to me. So is it, how is it delivered to me? Is it delivered in my house, in the community, down at the local McDonald's? How is this service given to me? The service, I could get the service when I needed it. The location of the service was convenient. Staff respected my religious and my spiritual beliefs as well. Can you kind of see a bit of a pattern here? Kids who answer these questions tend to report a better engagement with their services. The staff spoke in a way that I understood, which is nice. Staff were sensitive to my cultural and my ethnic background. Better. I am now better able to cope when things go wrong in my life. And of course, there was a service I needed but I couldn't get. And we use that question mostly as a test to see if, in fact, the kid would have preferred us asking them about a different service. When kids answer those questions, they report service satisfaction. And when they report service satisfaction, they do better in life. How can we be flooding kids with services to get them this? One of the other patterns we've been seeing in our research has been that kids actually will get flooded with services. But the more, and this is an interesting one, get this one, more services do not equal better outcomes. Now, any government officials in the room? I want you to club your ears. I don't want you to hear that statement. That's a dangerous statement. If you go into government and you say, less services, better outcomes, they all think, oh, great, we can shut down services. That's not the point. Fewer services engaged with children more intensely, longer, continuity of service creates better outcomes. If you think a court can, just because a kid has an anger management problem, okay, so you've been attending the Boys and Girls Club and everything else, and now you have you go to court on some little violence thing, whatever. Now we're going to give you an anger management course, so you're going to go see a psychologist. Right? Great. Okay, great. Oh, and then because you have another problem, I believe there's domestic violence in your home and stuff, okay? Okay, we're going to have you assessed for something else. Oh, you have a learning disability. Well, we're going to get you connected with a psychometrician at school. And we hop you around like that. The sum total is less, not more. Far less than more. Which again begs the question of, there are times I believe that the only person who's creating any kind of continuity in a child's life is a one-on-one worker, a mentor, a Robert who's a janitor in a facility. Workers come and workers go. Sometimes the most special people, the ones that have the biggest influence on kids, that's differential impact, the biggest and loudest impact, will actually be sometimes those informal relationships that are more sustaining, more continuous, and definitely more helpful to the particular child. Mostly, let's see if I can go. Mostly because I think through those relationships, kids hear 4 very powerful messages. They hear messages like you belong, you're trusted, you're responsible, and of course, you're capable. That's the trick. That's what we really want to have kids kind of hear. You know, it has an incredible amount of power. We do some work in Cambodia as well. And it was really interesting. There's a program called Cambodian Living Arts that in the post-Khmer Rouge era, when all the artists were killed, except for very, very few, there was an organization that tried to sustain the arts in Cambodia. And one of the things they did was they began to give $1 a day to the old masters who were living in incredible poverty, just to sort of, you know, to practice their music, to practice their dance, to practice their carving skills, or whatever it is that they could do. But the really clever thing about Cambodian Living Arts wasn't just that they tried to reawaken the arts by sustaining them in the last generation, those who had survived the purges of the killing fields, right? What they did was they reached out into the most impoverished, endangered communities and found kids who were the most vulnerable and paired those kids up with these old masters. That was magical. These kids, such as these girls right here, pictured practicing some of the dance moves, and then they'll eventually perform them for the part of the tourist trade. These girls would have drifted into the sex trade. There's a huge exploitation of teenage girls and boys in the sex trade in Cambodia. It's come over from Thailand, which is now not quite so popular because of some of the criminal cases and stuff like that. When you actually give kids something that's culturally relevant, and the arts are applauded by their parents. When a kid learns to do this kind of dancing, their parents are excited. There's something culturally relevant about this kind of engagement. There's a safety in that relationship. There's hopefulness and inspiration for the future, and there's a continuity in a relationship in a place where otherwise these kids would have none of those kinds of things. It's inspiring. It's inspiring whether you're in Cambodia or you're a bunch of kids in downtown Halifax. All kids need mentors. But I'm going to argue that the most vulnerable children in our communities need a sustaining relationship with a caring adult for a longer period of time, and then that can have a profound, profound impact on the well-being of those children over time and how they eventually get through life. And on that note, let me say thank you very much, and I hope in some small way I've added to your work, and all the best with it. It's very important. Thank you very much.
Wow. In listening to that, I was thinking, listening to Michael's speech, I was thinking about where we're situated in the Banff Centre for Performing Arts, which is really about inspiring creativity and sort of the magic within. And I think that's really what, when I was listening to Michael's words, that was what it was talking to me about, is it's inspiring the creativity and magic within. And think about how we started our day with Elder Dyla and talking about the spirit of the grandmothers and grandfathers and what they bring to us. And Tom talking about Bernie and Michael talking about Robert. But you took it a little bit further in telling us that relationships are critical but not enough. And I think what you did, at least for me today, is exactly what these symposiums are supposed to do. They challenge our thinking. They cause some places of tension, because it's in those places of tension that we pay attention. And so I know in my role in Walking Back, I need to think about some of the things that you talked to us about. I think about that mirrors game and that importance of changing roles. I think about what we're doing with government and community and funders all together, and what does it mean to change roles and to trouble what it is that we know and what it is that we're thinking. And I think about the negotiation that comes out of that as well, too. So while you might not have street cred, I think you do have lots of mentoring cred. And I do want to thank you very much for your provocative talk today and for getting us thinking about things that we might not have thought about before. So again, a reminder to all of you that Dr. Ungar's books are in the lobby. He will be here for about another hour before he has to leave. He's available to sign autographs as well too. And just have a bit of a conversation, because I know that there are lots of questions that are probably burning around in people's minds, and so please, I encourage you to take him up on that offer to have a bit of a conversation. So we're going to break now until 3 o'clock. The Cracker Barrel is going to be in here, so we would ask you to sort of leave the room for a short while so the Cracker Barrel participants can set up. 50 Ways to Leave Your Mentor is going to begin at 3 p.m. in room 303. Reminder that that is full, but the Cracker Barrel will have lots of very interesting, exciting, popping conversations. And I'd again ask you to join me back here again at 6 o'clock for the opening reception. Sorry, the opening reception will be on the 3rd floor. Thank you very much for a wonderful, provocative afternoon.